Hi, I'm Eliza King, and this is Chapter 7, The Era of Federal Social Services. So during his campaign, John F. Kennedy was pitted against Richard Nixon and promised to help elderly people with medical bills, develop programs to help Americans living in poverty, and to get the country moving again. After winning the election, he regarded New Deal reforms, providing economic resources and jobs to the poor. He was forced to appease both the North and South at the time, which had very conflicting ideals, and was seen as walking a political tightrope. The 60s was defined by a combination of affluence and poverty. The US dominated world trade as they were able to export at will and control domestic markets. African Americans, Latinos, and First Americans experienced intense poverty and violation of fundamental rights in the South and Southwest. 4.5 million African Americans migrated to the North and West between 1940 and 1970, and 90% settled in the large cities of 6 different states. Social Security, unemployment insurance, and aid to families with dependent children provided a very inadequate safety net for impoverished families. Women that had entered the workforce during World War II were now met with low paying jobs and were rarely given assistance with daycare needs. Blue collar workers faced hazardous working conditions, lacked health insurance, and relied on charity medicine. Jurisdictions lacked statutes that placed limits on involuntary commitment of persons with mental disorders to institutions, so many unwarranted admissions were made. Homosexuality was also widely perceived as a mental problem, and gay men and lesbian women often had to disguise their sexual orientation. The civil rights movement began quietly in the South in 1955, and it began with Martin Luther King Jr. heading a boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. After the murder of Emmett Till in 1955, the North and the mass media were fully aware of the struggle African Americans in the South were facing. Emmett Till became a martyr, and the civil rights movement became a national movement for the first time. In an attempt to support the movement, Kennedy created a task force headed by his VP, but it made little progress in addressing the real issues at hand. It wasn't until 1963 that Kennedy decided to propose civil rights legislation. After Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson came into presidency and was rarely consulted by Kennedy or his cabinet during his time as VP, but his administration achieved legislative successes comparable to those of Franklin Roosevelt. Johnson was driven to seek social reforms, spent incalculable hours writing legislation, and repeatedly brought himself to the point of exhaustion in seeking its enactment. His three fateful choices during his time as president were cutting taxes in 1964, sending large amounts of troops to Vietnam, and going all out in domestic reforms despite fiscal restraints. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 required desegregation of public facilities and prohibited discrimination in the hiring practices of firms and institutions that receive federal contracts. Public accommodations and public transportation were desegregated by 1965. Johnson later introduced the Civil Rights Act of 1965 after being confronted with massive civil rights protests. And Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Chief Justice during the time, became a driving force in the advancements of civil rights. He actually presided over the famous Brown versus Board of Education case. Medicare and Medicaid programs were passed in 1965 as titles of the Social Security Act, and the program was divided into 2 parts. Medicare appears to have increased utilizations of physicians and hospitals by poor persons, but provided a limited buffer against medical insolvency and did not help persons with chronic conditions. Medicaid was a matching grant program in which federal authorities paid a substantial share of the medical services, but ceded major administrative and policy roles to the states. The ESEA was passed in 1965 and provided federal assistance to public schools with relatively high concentrations of low-income children. Even after ESEA was enacted, huge differences in educational spending at the local level between affluent and poor neighborhoods continued. The War on Poverty was developed after Kennedy's death and consisted of job training, youth employment, and medical services that various departments had failed to enact during the former president's administration. Conservatives and liberals fought for and against AFDC all throughout the 60s. Johnson's administration introduced the Welfare Amendments of 1967, which ultimately satisfied no one. And the food stamp program was enacted in 1964 and was a landmark achievement because it provided millions of impoverished families with the resources to purchase food in quantities not possible with welfare checks and low-paying jobs. Many women wanted to enter the workforce following World War II, but discovered a number of barriers in the 60s. They were limited to jobs in clerical, sales, unskilled manufacturing, teaching, nursing, and social work, and were widely perceived as fragile, so protective laws kept them from arduous work. The gay and lesbian community began to develop organizations and leadership in the 50s, but these organizations lacked mass membership and had little to no success in changing policies. After the Stonewall riots in 1969, the gay and lesbian movements attracted mass membership and developed a political agenda. They made coming out a key organizing strategy, and they persuaded the APA to stop regarding gay men and lesbians as mentally ill. Latinos often came to the US for economic reasons because they had been displaced by the expansion of large American sugar and coffee corporations, and because factories and service industries in New York wanted and solicited cheap labor. Termination acts in the 50s and early 60s ended federal responsibility for various Native American tribes, forcing them to turn to state governments for assistance. The Bureau of Indian Affairs eventually became an advocate for Native Americans, and many Great Society programs channeled funds to the reservations for housing assistance, education, and economic development. In 1956, Japanese Americans won an initiative to overturn alien land laws, and because of Japanese American lobbyists, the federal government terminated the provisions of the naturalization law that refused citizenship to non white individuals in 1952. The National Council on Social Work Education was established in 1946 and renamed the Council on Social Work Education in 1952. In 1955, 7 separate social work associations were merged to form the National Association of Social Workers. At the time, social policy offerings in schools of social work were uneven and emphasized historical materials without also giving students the tools to engage in advocacy for the poor and other populations. Social work was heavily influenced by the turbulence of the late 50s and the 60s. And in 1969, the NASW decided to give regular membership to holders of bachelor's degrees from those undergraduate programs that met CSWE criteria, which was actually met with a lot of backlash from social work schools. But that's it. Thank you.